Thank you, Paul, for the introduction. Good morning, everyone. My name's Andrea, and a lot of what I'm going to cover was addressed in the bio. It's great to be here today to be at the Lyme conference. This is a conference that I've enjoyed attending since I was a fifth-year medical student. Thank you. That one there, excellent. Which was a while ago, and I found this site of learning and sharing to be a source of inspiration for working in medical education space. So it's a real privilege to be asked to present. Given my early career stage, I was a bit surprised, but it's a real honour to be here. I'd like to acknowledge, celebrate and pay respects to the traditional custodians of the land in which we share and meet today, the Ngambri and the Ngunnawal people. I'd like to acknowledge the ongoing connection to culture, country and waters of First Nations peoples. I'd also like to acknowledge other traditional custodians who are present here in the room today from across our country. And I also like to acknowledge other First Nations peoples from overseas, from Aotearoa and Canada. Also like to acknowledge that we have such a diverse group within medical education and within research, and non-Indigenous peoples bringing shared perspectives and backgrounds that makes a real richness within our medical education culture, and that working together in partnership is really important when approaching decolonisation, which I think I had as the first. Oops, I've gone backwards. So I hope to share some of my thinkings and learnings with you around what decolonisation and actions mean within a medical institution, drawing upon my experiences in research and education. I am Gija from the northwest of Western Australia, and would like to acknowledge that I've had a lot of support and mentorship to get here today. I listened to a webinar from Aotearoa recently. They had some really cool community of practice guidelines. One of them was that we can't be articulate all the time, which I liked, but the other was as individuals, we don't know much, but collectively we know a lot. So I'd like to say that I'm up here as one person speaking to you today, but I've drawn upon experiences, knowledge and wisdom from people who've spent decades working in this space. So I'd like to acknowledge that long-standing history and community members, colleagues, mentors and support that have kindly helped me going from medical school and through. I've also had the privilege to engage in qualitative research in a master's degree and PhD, getting to hear perspectives about communication skills and medical education from community members from South Australia and Western Australia, from medical students and from healthcare practitioners. So I'd like to acknowledge that generosity of sharing expertise, and I hope that I can carry forth that knowledge in my presentation today, and also within the work that I do in medical education going forward. So I thought it would be helpful. This audience would be an exception, but often when working in the space as a medical academic or as a researcher advocating for structural change or curriculum change, we see the words decolonisation flagged and used. Not often it seems well defined or understood at a broader level. And sometimes it can seem that decolonisation is flagged at a high level as a goal and a value without any understanding as to what that means in the day-to-day work, how that can guide our approaches and our actions. So I've drawn upon Linda Tahiwai Smith's landmark work, Maori scholar, around how decolonisation is that long-term process of understanding how colonial power shapes our institutions, our practices, and our ways of working, and that can negatively impact our health and well-being, and being able to constantly redress that power is an important part. That is not just the role and responsibility of Indigenous health educators or people working in Aboriginal health, but that's a whole of institutional commitment. and that it is distinct from the process of Indigenisation. And I found it helpful learning to distinguish between the two, that whilst they happen hand in hand and that they go collaboratively together, they are distinct. And they require a whole of institution understanding as to how we can ensure that Indigenous knowledges, knowers and ways of knowing can be included in a safe and effective way within our medical institutions. That previous definition was from Rhys Jones and colleagues in their paper Educating for Equity, the International Consensus Statement, which I found really useful as a junior academic when advocating for change. And they emphasised the importance of the entire institution engaging in a decolonisation process that goes into our systems, our structures, and the ways of working. And by doing that, we can begin to safely centre our ways of knowing, doing and being within curriculum, but also within the culture of the medical academy, our policies and our values. And that can begin to be a tool in which we can reclaim agency into how our narratives are shaped when preparing the future healthcare workforce to be really skilled and equipped in working with our communities as future doctors. Any conversation about decolonisation must have a conversation about the ongoing pervasive effects of institutionalised racism, both within our healthcare institutions and within our medical education structures and within our curriculum. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have been dehumanised through the medical lens, and being able to understand the ongoing role of dehumanisation and the pervasive effects that that has on accessing good healthcare within our systems and ensuring that we prepare a good healthcare workforce who are knowledgeable in the impacts of bias on decision making, on being able to ensure that resources are provided in an equitable way, requires consideration as to how racism is addressed and enacted within our education systems. As Juanita Sherwood and Olivia Negro outline in the textbook chapter in Better Bayali, racism is a foundational component around colonial ideologies and can be considered one of the most important indicators of poorer health within our communities through the ongoing effects of colonisation. We used to sing this song in the car as kids all the time, and I think it's becoming more and more sort of connected and relevant in the current sphere about being able to not just talk and hear statements or explicit kind of goals at a top level that aren't acted out in ways of working or having any sort of mechanisms for accountability. I was very fortunate to do a placement within New Zealand at the Maori Institute of Health with professors within Otago University, and I learnt a lot around this notion of praxis, around implementing theory to practice. Where is our action? How can we ensure that our knowledge and our reflection is committed and embodied in our day-to-day work? And that comes through in the relationships that we make with each other, with our wider community, and how we are ensuring that our approaches to curriculum, our approaches to sharing knowledge and constructing knowledge is underpinned by commitment to decolonisation and the safe co-location of Indigenous knowledges within our education system. So I might just quickly explore a little bit about myself. Too often in academia, we render our relationships and our power invisible by not bringing them forth into the light, explaining where we come from, who we are, as this heavily shapes how we come to know. So our construction of knowledge, how we share that knowledge, and our underlying value system. So it's important that we continually to be reflexive about our own positioning. And this is something that we can role model as within Indigenous health. We expect our students to be very self-aware of their own culture and their own self. And this is something that we as educators and academics can be skilled in as well. So as outlined, I'm Gija from the very top of Western Australia on my mother's side. My father's side, I have Scottish and Irish ancestry. The places where I've lived and worked are in the orange dots. My grandmother was born not far from where this photo was taken earlier this year, near Halls Creek in the top of WA. I grew up in Carnarvon, which is a small agricultural town that has a very negative history as to the ongoing roles of colonisation on the health and wellbeing of Indigenous peoples, with one of the lock hospitals being located 50 k's off the coast. I was very fortunate to be offered as a as a young high school graduate, the opportunity to study on Ngunnawal Country, a pre-medicine program. So that was an affirmative action program that gave me the opportunity to see if I was able and interested to study medicine. I completed a medical degree in Perth at UWA and a master's degree exploring clinical decision-making impacts, and was lucky to have an internship placement in Alice Springs at the hospital there. For the last 5 to 6 years, I've been living, studying and working in South Australia on Kaurna country, Bangla country and Ngukunu country, learning from local communities and establishing relationships, which has been really rewarding and highlights the stark diversity that exists within our communities and our varied ways of working and practice, and the importance of contextualised approaches when working in this space. I thought, given that we're on Ngambri and Ngunnawal Country, I'd reflect on an experience that I had as a second-year medical student, tossing out between applying for a job at the supermarket or applying for this in mid-semester break. And I got the opportunity to spend 6 weeks in the Office of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health in Canberra. In the second week, the Northern Territory emergency response was announced and introduced, and the team that I was working with was responsible for implementing that intervention. I had come from medical school where we had been learning and working about the importance of establishing relationships and having culturally informed care, to walking into the offices and there was mainstream health posters up. So it was a shock. The second week was a real eye-opener for me as to the gross misuse of power that can happen at the highest level and the ongoing pervasive effects of racism on decision-making and how that can influence our community's health and wellbeing. We changed buildings to an emergency response building across the road. There were people in army gear walking around. Teams were named Alpha, Delta, Charlie. And from my memories, the team that was responsible that I was working with had no heads up or inclusion or involvement about the intervention. And importantly, there was minimal relationship building and partnership with the communities impacted by this approach. For those that don't know, the intervention included a raft of reforms around welfare, around housing, around scrapping of permit systems, around restrictions of the use of alcohol and pornography, and accompanied were these quite derogatory signs that were placed out the front of communities. That was still there when I went back as an intern a while later. This goes to outline not only the gross misuse of power and the role of decision-making, but how when we make decisions that aren't in alignment with our worldviews and values, not only do they not work in the time, but they can have generational negative impacts. Professor Helen Milroy, one of our leading advocates and practitioners, has this beautiful painting. And as we know, health is quite an abstract concept. It's experienced differently amongst different communities, families and individuals, and it's heavily guided by our backgrounds and our experiences of the world. through an Aboriginal perspective of health. Health involves our physical health, which is closely connected to our country, as outlined by Professor Milroy, but also includes our cultural integrity, our spiritual well-being, and our social and emotional well-being. And decisions made purely with power and political agenda in mind that might focus on a biomedical approach that completely ignores our culture and our spiritual well-being, as outlined by Professor Peter O'Mara, representing the Australian Indigenous Doctors Association, reporting that these approaches won't work, and they can cause generational harm. And I probably don't need to reiterate this, but just to note that the Racial Discrimination Act at the time was suspended in order for this intervention to be introduced. As outlined by Ida and Professor Peter O'Mara, what was heavily recommended at the time was the importance of stopping external decision-making that does not consider local communities' needs or worldviews, and to invest in Indigenous leadership, relationship building and partnership moving forward. And I think this is highly relevant given our current political context and conversations at the moment about having decision-making and control at all levels, including within our government. I was lucky, just recently finished a PhD that was inspired by work being done across Australia from the innovative leading work being done in Aotearoa with the Meihana model and the Hui process, and approaches to working across diverse knowledge systems in Canada put forth by Mi'kmaq elders of Two-Eyed Seeing. Whilst I won't go into the details of the framework that was put forth within my PhD work, that was a heavily collaborative approach to research, and I was very fortunate to have a strong Indigenous governance group within that research structure. It was made really clear when talking to community members that we can have great curriculum and great assessment, but if we don't have a really effective learning environment that can nurture our students and nurture the staff working in the space, then the work won't be effective and it won't flourish. So how do we ensure that whilst we're doing good work in education, we're continuing to advocate for Indigenous representation and leadership across the board, both from academic and professional staff, representation within our student cohort, and ensuring that there are policies and practices that represent Indigenous perspectives co-located alongside mainstream medicine. And this is important not just within undergraduate medical education, but as we know, working in the space is a lifelong career trajectory, and investing in postgraduate training and beyond in this space was highlighted by people that I was talking to through this approach. So when thinking about decolonisation, these are the points that come forward to me that are important at the moment. They might change and I've likely missed some, but being able to think around examining privilege and redressing racism, being responsive about power and undoing unhelpful hierarchies within our medical system, and safely and effectively centering our ways of knowing, doing and being. This can lead to transformative research and education, and prioritising, centering, relationship building at the heart of all the work that we do. I was speaking to a colleague and a mentor recently about what would have happened if we had placed one of those awful signs out the front of Parliament House, and that people within the decision-making institution had to follow what they were imposing on others. And it makes us think around examining those unearned, unacknowledged benefits, respects and prestige that people can have, who gets a statue and who gets a sign. So being able to bring forth privilege within our medical system is really important in starting to redress racism and ensure that Indigenous ways of knowing are valued and respected within our ways of working. As Barry Lovely and Laurie Harding from the textbook chapter, White Benevolence, Canadian text, talk about it's not only just important to prepare healthcare practitioners to be understanding of bias, to actively redress negative systems within the healthcare practice, but we need to ensure that the learning environments that people are going through are effectively aligned to address racism. So anti-racism is not just a responsibility within the formal curriculum, because it can be pervasive through informal and hidden curriculum actions as well. So leading from the top, ensuring that our leadership and our education staff are skilled and trained and have the capacities to not only recognise when racism is coming through, but being able to interrupt those and to have mechanisms of accountability so that this is not just another goal, but is something that we are measuring and ensuring is being actioned across our institutions. With accountability being from both Western and Indigenous perspectives as well. I think anyone who's worked in medicine understands the embedded hierarchies that exist within our profession that are slowly starting to shift. But historically, we've seen quite strong hierarchies of who gets power, who is the ultimate sayer of what's true, of what action gets taken, whose knowledge is the most legitimate and the most valued. And we see hierarchies, triangles in what research is most valued, who gets the final say. Being able to think about that entrenched power imbalances that exist in medicine and thinking about how we can become more responsive to ensuring that diverse perspectives and ways of knowing are brought forth and are valued and seen as legitimate. This requires us to think about how we can ensure that we're continuing to break down the boundaries of what's perceived as knowledge legitimacy that extends outside of our dominant underpinning of medicine in Australia and of many of our healthcare designs, which is founded on a biomedical approach. Biomedical approaches to knowledge are quite reductionist, can tend to focus more on diagnosis and treatment, with less emphasis on our broader cultural, social well-beings. And whilst the biomedical approach has its strengths, without bringing in diverse perspectives, we can't begin to shift some of the entrenched inequities around health and around the health of our environment. So hierarchy exists within our relationships with each other, can often place the health and well-being of dominant groups over others, but it can place our own health as more important than other living entities and the environment that we live in. And this is an urgent priority for us as we seek to see change in the climate emergency we are experiencing. This will impact resource allocation, so who gets to decide how funding is distributed and how it's used and how it's prioritised within research, within curriculum, and with broader relationship and community involvement. I've had a number of chats lately in a lead up to a bit of an extended leave time, and I've had a number of community members say we do circles, not triangles, and being able to ensure our circles are broad, that we are connecting with each other, and that we are working in a way that does not dominate or prioritise one way of knowing over the other. Janet Stajic is an Indigenous health scholar from Queensland. And reflects in her paper about her role as an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health worker in a journey through research into postgraduate studies. And she reflects on the role of the racial hierarchy within our healthcare system and within the knowledge hierarchy, and feeling that role of the health worker workforce can sometimes be seen as less than or less valued and as an assistant. But we're seeing more and more now within research and education that our health workforce and our diverse approaches to knowledge are starting to be respected and centred in guiding institutional actions. I found it really helpful as a research student going through my PhD. When I first saw the word epistemology, I think I ignored it for like 2 years because it just seemed too hard to understand. But I've now come to realise that it's really important in understanding how we navigate research and how we navigate our educational practices. So Canadian Indigenous researcher Sean Wilson talks about our knowledge paradigm as being these 4 parts. So our ontology, so how we see the world, our epistemology, the ways in which we think about the world, and as First Nations scholars, this is heavily influenced by colonisation, by ongoing experiences of racism and marginalisation within our country, and our ongoing fight for political recognition. Our axiology, so our values, our ethics, the central importance of family, spirituality within health and well-being. And these shape the tools and ways in which we use to construct knowledge, which is our methodology. And this is, whilst it's more than the sum of the 4 parts, as Sean Wilson explains, it's heavily dynamic, reflexive and fluid to the work that we're doing at the time, and very relational. So our experiences of the world and of where we're working is highly dependent on the relationships that we have with each other and with our wider environment, which goes to lead to the importance of contextual approaches to education in this space. Professor Rigney, South Australian Indigenous scholar, emphasises the importance of any narratives that influence or affect Indigenous peoples needing to have our worldviews and our values and our interests at the centre of any work being done. Which led me to a bit of a learning journey as to how to work well across diverse systems of knowledge, ensuring that this perspectives in health that include both mainstream biomedical approaches and Indigenous knowledge systems are done underpinned by a basis of respect, without one system dominating the other or consuming the other. So I've taken a lot of inspiration from Mi'kmaq elders from Canada who present the conceptual notion of two-eyed seeing. So seeing from the strengths of Indigenous ways of knowing, the strengths and Western ways of knowing, coming together to create solutions to some of those deep, complex barriers that we continue to face, both in education and healthcare delivery. I've taken inspiration from Gunma, presented by the Ngambri Nation here in Australia, in Central Australia, that talks about the salt and the fresh water coming together silently. The waters mix and symbolically create foam. Foam represents new knowledge. But importantly, the salt doesn't forget that it's salt water, the fresh stays fresh. They don't mix, forget who they are or where they've come from or what their identities and their histories are. And this can help to prevent the domination and the consummation of one knowledge system over the other. So it requires us to know who we are, to stay true to who we are, to be authentic, and to know that we can engage in the space from diverse backgrounds and perspectives if approached in a way of respect, and being able to hold at sites of difference. Having those points of difference often can be very hard. It can cause a lot of discomfort, but sitting with them and working through can lead us to start to shift some of the really hard barriers that we see when we have convergence of knowledge systems and difference in opinion. This does require a strong accountability approach, given our historical and ongoing and contemporary marginalisation of ways of knowing and oppression of Indigenous perspectives and knowers within the academy. So accountability was something that I thought through quite a lot with the support of my research team in the PhD and with my Indigenous governance group. As outlined in the United Declarations of the Rights of Indigenous People, not only do we have a right to be involved as decision makers, but we have fundamental rights in being able to set up the processes and the structures and the institutions in which decisions are made. This came out I think this was rejected by the government of the time that introduced the the intervention, not surprisingly, but was later ratified in 2009, which I guess can show, a bit of help that whilst things politically might not be happen at one point, that they may come through at a later time. So when working the PhD, I had an Indigenous governance group, and we thought through what governance meant from both an Indigenous and a non-Indigenous perspective, and what some of the humanistic qualities were around working in this space. And I've got some diagrams essentially just to outline that we work through what roles, knowledge and expertise that were held by both Indigenous and non-Indigenous partners, and what some of their actions and ways of being were of people working in governance in that space. So we had Indigenous partners as being ones to lead, direct, determine and decide, and non-Indigenous partners being able to have skills of listening, facilitating, supporting and working alongside. It was heavily relationship-based. The governance panel I had known for some time. We had respect for each other and the different knowledges and experiences that we brought to the research process. And non-Indigenous partners were experienced in Indigenous health research and healthcare delivery. And we had a strong relationship amongst the research team to be able to have the necessary conversations about the research process and the outcomes. We agreed with what was being written in the literature around challenging the notion of strengthening capacity around Indigenous governance, given that we have demonstrated a long-standing history to be able to decide and lead within our communities. So we opted more for capacity strengthening around Indigenous governance, recognising our decision-making power has been previously eroded through the impacts of colonisation, and that this requires resources and human capacities if we are to translate a similar governance structure from the research process within our medical systems to ensure that work being done within Indigenous health is being held accountable to the local community involved. We worked through what our distinct roles and responsibilities would be, and where our boundaries of knowledge sharing were, coming through with the notion of the importance of consensus decision making and not majority rule, which requires effective relationship and trust within the research team. And finalising the governance process, we thought, how would we translate a similar approach within education? And that came to the fundamental importance around relationship building. And that everything that we do within Indigenous health is heavily based on relationships. If we're able to establish relationships both within the local community, within the community stakeholders relevant within the medical academy, that this is foundational to building trust and respect. It's came through a lot in my research when forming good therapeutic relationships in Indigenous health. Yeah, so this was a key finding within the study, but also within education, is that we can have all of the skills and the knowledge and the expertise, but without building the relationships with the local community and within our community stakeholders, that anything that we bring to the table will be useless. So I think the previous slides were just some quotes around transformative education, an education that can challenge people's perspectives and encourage them to shift practice and behaviours, and being able to challenge some of the medical culture that positions doctors as the ultimate knowers and encourages collaborative practice to thinking about what are the boundaries of our own knowledge and being able to ensure that diverse perspectives are informing both our clinical practice but our medical education as well. As outlined by Professor Paul, when we're able to start to shift some of our educational narratives, but also some of our assessment, we can begin to shift some of the culture in which we work. And I was hoping to reflect on an assessment practice that I was involved in with Adelaide Uni in bringing forth a podcast, which was a narrative assessment that included perspectives from local communities with a topic that was selected and designed by the students to encourage the building of relationships and the prioritisation of local community perspectives within their learning. This was an assessment for learning approach. And the students are mentored across the year within their ways of working with the community and in the development of their podcast. And that assessment is assessed and designed and considered from multiple perspectives, both from Western medical practitioners and the Aboriginal health team. So that team approach and that contextualised approach can help around effective assessment. So I might just start to finish off around emphasising the importance of the local context, and this came through a lot in the research as we are diverse communities and our ways of working inherently unique and different depending on our background, our experiences and our worldviews. So being able to ensure that we're building respectful and authentic relationships with those that we are working in, and being guided by notions of wise practice. Wise practice can encourage us to shift away from what's often talked about in medicine of best practices approach that has a knowledge hierarchy that suggests that there's one right way of doing things. Wise practice realises that taking one way of doing things and embedding it within a community without consultation is ineffective, as it recognises that we are all diverse and different. It advocates against structural sameness and replicating institutions and systems that are similar to thinking about how our ways of working are heavily relationship-based and dependent on the context. Begins to think about what might change if we're to continue to be valued as academics and researchers through a decolonial lens. What ways of working might be prioritised? How would this change our criteria for promotion, for timelines, and our workplace roles and allocation of duties? Will we consider the important roles of relationship and engagements over things around publication and research funding amounts in regards to what's valued activities within the academy? So I thought I would end here with a quote from Professor Helen Milroy. As we work in the space of health and wellbeing and being able to think about renewal and moving forward, engaging in practices and actions of redressing colonial power and decolonisation, ensuring that we can centre Indigenous ways of knowing, can renew our healthcare systems, can renew our educational approaches and start to shift some of our medical culture. And I've found keeping hope, given the recent political context around our referendum and our recognition of sovereignty in this country, is important to think about how we can continue to take small actions within our spheres of influence as educators, as researchers, or as healthcare practitioners. So sorry about the IT issues. If you have any questions, comments, critiques or reflections, please come and talk to me throughout the conference. My email is up on just here on the post, or reflect in other avenues on social media. Thank you for bearing with me and I hope you have a great rest of the conference. I'm really looking forward to the rest of the talks and presentations.